Well, hello, people. Welcome back to 90 and Out. I'm Timothy Holt, and this is the What is the Bible podcast, where we look at what is this thing right here. What is the 66 books of the Protestant Bible? If you're following this podcast, you can check out the other videos in the series covering an overview of the Bible, the New Testament, the Old Testament. We've got the books of the law, also known as the Torah, and pretty much every division in the Old Testament. Now we are looking at the New Testament. We're shifting focus to the New Testament. There's about 400 years of silence, big air quotes there, between Malachi, the close of the Old Testament, and Matthew, the beginning of the New Testament. The New Testament is 27 books. We're going to be looking at the first 4 books. They are biographical. They're Greco-Roman biographies of Jesus of Nazareth in this video. Also, if you like this content, hit that follow button, hit that like button, hit all of those cool buttons, do the social media stuff. We would greatly appreciate it if you help this channel grow. If you are noticing some themes with the new office studio, it's the Building the Kingdom One Brick at a Time podcast setup behind me. We've got some Lego features right there. And I do enjoy playing with the bricks. So let's get right to it. Let's cue the music and get right to what are the Gospels of Jesus of Nazareth. So let's look at the very first gospel. It's Matthew. Matthew is an eyewitness. By the way, there's 2 eyewitnesses. We're going to start with that. 2 eyewitnesses, Matthew and John. They cover 2 different perspectives of the same guy over about the same period of time. Now, you might be asking yourself, yeah, but John doesn't have any genealogy in it. John is not one of the synoptic gospels. John stands out by itself. You're right, there's a reason for that. It's because John is historically credited with the Apostle John, which was one of Jesus's inner circle. He was there and could witness more personal interactions between Jesus and other people. He also sees this interpersonal aspect of Jesus that some of the other disciples would not necessarily see. Not because they weren't around, but because they weren't as close. Well, Matthew is definitely in one of the wider groups. He's in the group of 12, but he's not in the group of 3. John is. So it kind of makes sense. I think it's reasonable to expect a more personal side of Jesus portrayed in John than in Matthew. Matthew is the most Jewish of all of the books. He is. If you check out last week's live stream on Rumble, building for the kingdom one brick at a time, I focused on Matthew being called as a disciple, and that kind of plays in here. Matthew is a former Roman tax collector turned apostle of Jesus. He gave up the wealthy life to follow this guy. And then after this guy dies and his body goes missing, Matthew is a key figure. By the way, his body goes missing because if you're a Christian, you believe he rose from the dead. And I think there's good reason to believe that. Matthew's most notable contribution to the gospel, if you will, other than all the Jewishness of it, is, the Sermon on the Mount. It's probably the most well-known sermon or recognizable sermon of Jesus or collection of teachings of Jesus. It starts with the Beatitudes. He gives this speech early on in his public ministry as a rabbi. And it starts out with, the blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And it goes on. But it also has that often misused and misunderstood and abused passage in chapter 7, which is in the middle of this speech, and that is, judge not, that you be not judged, for with what you judge, you will be judged also. And the measure you use, you will be measured back to you. It ends with this pretty cool analogy, parable about building on a rock and a firm foundation versus sand. And the storms of life hitting your house, and either it's standing or falling. That's Matthew, right? If you want a good overview of the gospel of Jesus, Matthew's got it. Also, Matthew is the longest of the 4 biographies. It's definitely written in the Greco-Roman style of a biography. It is written early. Often it is credited to be written in the 60s AD, so we're talking about 30 years after the events that takes place. There is a theory that Matthew basically cliff notes and borrows off of Mark, but if you actually read the Gospels, I don't think that holds much water. I think it's pretty weak sauce. I think it's much more likely that Matthew and John are writing about the same time and definitely know each other's writing. You've got a list of the 12. You've got all the key points. There is nothing in Matthew that doesn't say Jesus is God. He heals multitudes. He proclaims himself as the Messiah. Matthew calls back to the Old Testament often with prophetic saying, hey, this person talked about this guy, kind of thing. So that's Matthew in a nutshell. Matthew could have been married, but as a former Roman tax collector, he would have been prohibited from most of Second Temple Jewish life, which makes it kind of interesting that he would have been in that group of close disciples. So the Jesus, something I just turned to it here that I want to point out is the transfiguration on the mountain. So Jesus is seen. Matthew records this event, and Jesus goes up to a mountain. And he's transfigured. He changes form, and he's seen with Moses and Elijah. And the reason this stands out to me is because I think it's a collapsing of time and space. Elijah is on the same mountain as Moses. Moses gets the law on Mount Horeb, also known as Sinai. Elijah, he gets the whirlwind and the earthquake and the fire, and then the quiet, still voice. Right? That's all on the same mountain as this transfiguration. So, is Jesus collapsing time here? It's one of the great mysteries. Mark is the next one. Excuse me. Mark is our next biographer. Now, Mark is not an eyewitness. No one of any legitimacy will claim that Mark is an eyewitness. He is overtly not an eyewitness. Most likely this is John Mark, a second generation follower of Jesus. John Mark is generally credited with the gospel according to Mark. And Mark starts out right in the middle of the action. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in the prophets, behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. And then he talks about John the Baptist, pointing people directly to Jesus. The one crying in the wilderness is John the Baptist, and the way of the Lord is Jesus. Some people claim that Mark does not make any direct claims of Jesus' divinity. I think that's hogwash. I think that's weak sauce, because right here he talks about this prophecy, which I believe is Isaiah, about preparing the way for the coming Messiah, the Lord. The Lord is Yahweh. And then he talks about John the Baptist pointing to Jesus. Points directly to Jesus. There's several other things where there's an entire discourse between some Pharisees and Jesus about who can forgive sins. And Jesus says, you're right. No one can forgive sins except God, except Yahweh. And look, I'm forgiving sins. And then they picked up stones to stone him for blasphemy. Why? Because he's claiming to be God. Mark is the shortest of the four Gospels. It's the most action-packed. There are more miracles in the Gospel of Mark than the other three Gospels. There's also some other tidbits where women play a bigger role, or seem to play a bigger role. There's no major speeches in Mark. It's all about the action. I like to describe the Gospel according to St. Mark as the Michael Bay of the Gospels. Okay, so Michael Bay is a producer and director of movies, and they're always action-packed with big explosions, and there's just enough dialogue to connect the action scenes, right? And that's kind of like what we get in Mark. Mark is by far the shortest of the four Gospels, but it's so action-packed. It's the action-adventure story of Jesus. They're constantly going places. He uses immediately and after this, then that kind of thing. He also uses what's known as the Mark sandwich approach. And that's where he starts with one narrative, and then he'll cut in with something that seems unrelated, and then he'll loop back to what he was talking about. Okay? Some historians and some scholars say that Mark is accurate but disjointed for that reason. I don't know about disjointed being the right word for it. I kind of like the sandwich approach. But it makes sense if you know much about Christian history outside of the Bible. We're talking 1st, 2nd, 3rd century Christian history. And that is that Mark is listening to Peter preaching. Peter is issuing sermons, he's speaking, and he's preaching. And what is he preaching? He's preaching the kingdom of God. He's fulfilling the Great Commission, right? Well, if you've listened to very many people preach, you'll know that they tend to go on rabbit trails from time to time. They also will create this like start point, and then they'll go, oh, and then blah, 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 and then they'll loop back to a previous point. That is common in preaching, even today. So it makes sense that Mark, writing down Peter's sermons, because he was a professional scribe, that's what he did, he would have that kind of motif. And if you read Mark, you'll pick up on places where it's like, oh, this would make a really good sermon if I just read this, right? And that's also why every single chapter in Mark has Jesus portrayed as God in some way. Casting out demons, forgiving sins, feeding the 5,000, where he essentially creates food out of nothing. It's bread and fish, which mirrors the manna and quail back in Genesis. Just a little tidbit there. Mark is also written fairly early, most likely in the 60s, before 70 AD. And the reason a lot of people, including myself, believe it was written before then is because there is no mention of the destruction of Jerusalem. And that happens under Tiberius in 70 AD. completely revolutionizes and changes the Jewish religion, um, abruptly ending the Second Temple period and starting the Rabbinic period, which, by the way, Judaism is still in today because they don't have another temple. So they haven't entered into a third temple period. My Out of the four biographies of Jesus, I enjoy Mark. I enjoy reading Mark on a casual basis as well as a study basis. But to me, it is the easiest one to just read through casually, is the book of Mark. The other thing about Mark is the ending. In the ancient manuscripts, we have 3 different endings commonly found in Mark. So some Bible printings, like this one, which is New King James, has the longer ending of Mark, but it also has a footnote about the longer ending of Mark. And that is this, and I'm just going to read it here from the publishers. These verses, that's Mark 16, 9 through 20, are missing in some of the oldest manuscripts of Mark. See center column note. Some scholars believe the end of the original scroll of Mark was lost and that later copyists wrote these verses to give an appropriate conclusion to the account. They summarize the appearances of Jesus after his resurrection, which are also recorded in other Gospels and Acts. So, from 9 to 20 summarizes and condenses all different things that happen after the resurrection. Okay? If we end Mark with a shorter ending, we still have the resurrection. I've heard some secular and doubting scholars that Mark does not end with the resurrection. It does, no matter which ending you use, you accept, he still ends with the resurrection. Verse 6, but he said to them, do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him, as he said you would. So they went out quickly and fled from the tomb, for they trembled and were amazed, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. That's the short ending. By the way, there's a middle ending too that's right around verse 14, okay? But your longer ending gives a little more appropriate ending to it. And again, this is getting written at the same time. You got sermons going on. Also, how do we know that these old manuscripts are actually older than the others? I don't know. I'm not that kind of a Bible scholar yet. Might in the future be that kind of Bible scholar, but right now I'm not. So I'm a little skeptical on the whole oldest, newest, whatever, the dating of manuscripts, because I just don't know how they're dated. What I do know is clearly every copy that has the ending of Mark, whether it's the long ending, the short ending, or the middle ending, has the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. And that makes sense, because without the resurrection, there is no Christianity. Now we're going to go into Luke. Now you might be wondering why at this point I'm going in this order, and it's because almost every printing that I know of the Gospels of Jesus, the Greco-Roman biographies, are in this order: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The 2 eyewitnesses bookend the 2 second-hand historians. Okay? You got Matthew at the beginning, you got Mark and Luke in the middle, and then you got John at the end. Okay? Even this has been the order even in antiquity. All right? The Didache, Origin, all of those, right? Anywhere where we have found Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John together, they've been in this order, as far as I know. If you know otherwise, put in the comments. Let me know. So, Luke is the other secondhand historian. Luke is a doctor by trade, and he is a traveling evangelist and supporter of Paul the Apostle. Yeah, that Paul. Saul of Tarsus becomes Paul. Luke travels with him a lot throughout the book of Acts. And Luke is like a part one of two parts. It's a first volume in a 2-volume set. Both are written specifically to a guy named Theophilus. Again, I'm going to read it right at the beginning. Inasmuch as many have taken in hand to set in order a narrative of those things which have been fulfilled among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the world delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write to you an orderly account, most excellent Theophilus. Theophilus is capitalized. It's a proper name. Acts of the Apostles is part 2. So if you read Luke and then immediately go into Acts, it flows seamlessly. Luke has the other birth narrative. It's clear that Luke is a historian writing a Greco-Roman biography from start to finish. He gives subtle hints and nods to his sources, like Mary, when he talks about Mary keeping all these things in her heart, right? He mentions other people by name, like the 2 kids of, I think his name's Simon of Cyrene, the guy who carries the cross for Jesus. He mentions Rufus, and I can't think of his brother's name right now. But those are subtle nods to his sources in the Greco-Roman biography fashion. He also gets names, titles, local titles, correct in an insanely accurate way. He calls the Lake of Tiberias the Lake of Tiberias when it is actually called the Lake of Tiberias. When it's not the Lake of Tiberias, when it's the Sea of Galilee, he calls it the Sea of Galilee. Like, his attention to detail is explicit. The other thing is, he mentions specific disease processes, and he just casually drops them in. I am a professional paramedic when I'm not doing this, and I will use medical jargon in everyday speech, and then I find myself sometimes getting asked, what does that mean? And I'm like, oh, wait, yeah, you wouldn't know that because you're not in my profession, kind of thing. And Luke is just phenomenal at it. There are many people on YouTube, Rumble, and other social medias that are far more inept, adapted, and skilled at breaking all of that down. Feel free and use them as sources, but Luke is got it in spades when it comes to reliability. Which brings us neatly to the Gospel according to John. Now, the Gospel according to John, a lot of people I know, they recommend starting here. If you are new to Christianity, if you have never been exposed to Jesus Christ, a lot of people I know will say, read the Gospel of John. Start with John, because John gives Jesus as such a personal element to him. It is clear that the guy writing it knows Jesus of Nazareth on a personal, intimate way. Right from the beginning, he talks about the Word becoming flesh and being from the beginning. It's a beautiful setup. And the light coming into the world, forgiveness of sins. In a nighttime encounter, we get the most famous verse in the entire Bible, right here in John. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. John is all about the person of Jesus of Nazareth being God. There is deep theology throughout John. John is not part of the synoptics, meaning Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they cover mostly the same events and the same things. They just cover it from different angles. John, on the other hand, covers personal conversations and interactions throughout his biography. I think there's something like 60-some% of John is exclusively to the Gospel of John. So if you're still watching this or listening to this podcast, you're probably going, man, you're just gushing about the Gospel of John. Like, maybe I should start with the Gospel of John. And I'm going to say no. I would not recommend starting with John if you have no basis whatsoever, if you have no familiarity with Jesus or the gospel of Jesus Christ. I would start with Mark. It's the shortest. You're still going to get all of that theology. You're just going to get it from a different perspective. But I understand why a lot of people, especially people who grew up in church, who grew up around Christians, who may have, as some people say, fallen away from the faith, would like to go straight to John. Yeah, if you have some basis or foundation of what Christianity is, John is a great starting point to start your personal Bible study. But if you have no idea whatsoever, I would start with Mark. And then I would go with Matthew, Luke, and John. Okay? John has the empty tomb. John has the crucifixion. John has Peter restored with eating fish for breakfast. John has the most events post-resurrection is in the book of John. All right? So, with that, why... How do I put this? Why, to close this off, why should you read the Gospels? Because no matter how you look at them, you do not have Christianity without the gospel of Jesus the Christ. You cannot have social Christianity. You cannot have cultural Christianity. You cannot have political Christianity. You can't have any of the good stuff of Christianity without the actual Christ, without Jesus. The entire Old Testament points to Jesus of Nazareth. The entire New Testament points to Jesus of Nazareth. Without the perfect man, who is both God and man, living that perfect sinless life, dying that perfect sacrificial death, and rising from the dead, there is no Christianity. There isn't. It's all hinging on the historicity and factualness of what these 4 Greco-Roman biographies contain. So you have to ask yourself, is it reliable? Do I have good reason to believe what is written? And then you have to ask yourself, what are you going to do with it? What do you do with it? Is he a liar? Because he makes some pretty outlandish claims in these biographies. Is he a lunatic? Is he a crazed madman? Delusional? Or is he exactly who he claims to be? God in the flesh. All right, so if you're still with me at this point in time in the podcast. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. I'm Timothy Holt. This is What is the Bible podcast on 90 and Out, looking at the 4 Greco-Roman biographies of Jesus of Nazareth, a rabbi in first century Judea. If you like this content, help this channel out. Hit that subscribe button. Hit that follow button. Like, share, comment, all that good stuff. Love to hear from you. And check out the rest of the channel content. Building for the kingdom, one brick at a time, is a lot of fun. Where I build a Lego model like these, and talk about Spirit and Life Seminary, the Bible, Christian theology, all that good stuff. So if you like Legos, Lego models, if you like talking about Jesus and Christianity, then join me for that. We also have the words in red when Jesus speaks, which is where we look at just that, what Jesus is credited saying in the 4 biographies. So check out that, and till next time, may God bless you and keep you. May his face shine upon you and give you peace. I'm Timothy Holt with 90 and Out.